They called them conductors, but the truth is far more extraordinary. The Underground Railroad wasn't guided by white saviors or northern abolitionists alone, but by enslaved black people who risked torture and death to become the secret pilots navigating others through the darkness toward freedom, and their genius changed American history forever. Before we journey into this incredible true story of courage, strategy, and liberation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. These are the histories that textbooks left out, and every single one deserves to be told and remembered. The year was 1838, and in the tobacco fields of Maryland, a young enslaved man named Samuel worked with his hands in the soil, while his mind mapped escape routes through terrain he'd never physically traveled. Samuel was 23 years old, born into bondage on a plantation where his mother had been sold away when he was 7, and his father had been worked to death by the time he turned 12. The overseer considered Samuel a model slave, obedient, hard-working, eyes always downcast in the presence of white people. But what the overseer couldn't see was the brilliant mind cataloging every piece of information, every scrap of geographic knowledge, every whispered rumor about the routes north that Samuel was assembling into a mental map more accurate than anything the slaveholders possessed. Samuel had taught himself to read by studying discarded newspapers and watching the plantation owners' children do their lessons through the window. This was a crime punishable by brutal whipping or worse, but Samuel understood something fundamental. Knowledge was power, and literacy was the key to understanding the world beyond the plantation's suffocating boundaries. He read about cities in the north, about states where slavery was illegal, about a place called Canada where fugitives could never be recaptured under American law. Most importantly, he read between the lines of the slaveholders' own newspapers, which constantly complained about enslaved people escaping, about mysterious networks helping runaways, about the economic losses the South was suffering as human property kept vanishing into the night. Those complaints told Samuel something crucial. Escape was possible, people were succeeding, and there was a system in place to help. He just had to figure out how to access it. The plantation where Samuel lived was located in southern Maryland, roughly 80 miles from the Pennsylvania border, where slavery ended and freedom theoretically began. 80 miles might as well have been 8,000 given the patrols, the professional slave catchers, the brutal laws that incentivized every white person to stop and question any black person traveling alone. The journey required more than courage. It required detailed planning, strategic thinking, knowledge of terrain and weather patterns, understanding of human psychology, and the ability to read situations and make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between liberation and recapture. Samuel spent 3 years preparing for his escape, 3 years of patient observation and careful information gathering, 3 years of building the mental and physical strength required for what he was about to attempt. But when Samuel finally ran in the autumn of 1838, he wasn't running alone, and that changed everything. What made Samuel think he could guide others when he'd never even escaped himself? Samuel had been secretly teaching 5 other enslaved people on the plantation. 2 women named Hannah and Esther, a teenage boy named Isaac, and a married couple, James and Clara. They met in the woods after dark, after exhausting days of forced labor, and Samuel shared everything he'd learned. How to navigate by the North Star, which plants were edible if they ran out of food, how to move silently through underbrush, how to disguise their scent from the dogs that would inevitably be set on their trail. More than tactics, Samuel taught them something even more valuable. He taught them to believe escape was possible, to see themselves as intelligent strategists rather than helpless victims, to understand that their lives belonged to them regardless of what the law claimed. The night they chose for their escape was moonless and cloudy, providing maximum darkness to cover their movements. They left nothing behind that would indicate planning, no hidden supplies, no farewell notes, because the longer it took the slaveholder to realize they were gone, the more distance they could cover. Samuel led them away from the plantation, using a route he'd mentally rehearsed hundreds of times, moving through the forest rather than along roads where patrols would be watching. Every sound made them freeze. The snap of a branch, the call of a night bird, the distant baying of dogs. But Samuel kept them calm, kept them moving, kept them believing that freedom was just ahead if they could maintain their courage and discipline. By dawn, they had covered nearly 15 miles, a remarkable distance given the terrain and their need for stealth. They hid in a dense thicket near a stream, taking turns sleeping while others kept watch, nibbling on the small amount of food they'd managed to smuggle away from the plantation. Samuel knew this was just the beginning, that they had weeks of travel ahead of them, that every day would bring new dangers and challenges. But as he looked at the 5 people who had trusted him enough to risk everything, he felt something shift inside himself, a sense of purpose that transcended his own survival, a commitment to getting these people to freedom no matter what it cost him personally. That commitment would define the rest of Samuel's life and transform him from a runaway slave into one of the Underground Railroad's most legendary conductors. How would a man who'd never tasted freedom learn to guide others to it? The journey north was a masterclass in strategy and survival that tested every ounce of Samuel's intelligence and resourcefulness. They traveled exclusively at night, sleeping during the day in barns, caves, dense forests, anywhere that offered concealment from the searching eyes of slave catchers and their dogs. Samuel had memorized the names of certain houses, certain people who might offer help. Information gleaned from whispered conversations among enslaved people, from coded references in abolitionist newspapers, from the underground network of communication that existed beneath the slaveholders' awareness. These were the stations of the Underground Railroad, though Samuel didn't know to call it that yet, and reaching them required navigating by instinct and faith as much as by any concrete directions. The first station they reached was a Quaker household in northern Maryland, identified by a specific quilt pattern hanging on the clothesline, a signal Samuel had been told to watch for. The family, risking enormous legal penalties for harboring fugitives, hid them in their basement for 2 days, fed them their first full meal since escaping, and provided detailed directions to the next safe house. The wife, a stern-faced woman named Margaret, looked at Samuel with an expression he'd never seen a white person direct at him before. Respect, recognition of his humanity, acknowledgement of his courage and capability. She told him that what he was doing, leading others to freedom, was the work of a conductor, and that the network needed people like him desperately. Those words planted a seed in Samuel's mind that would grow into his life's calling. He had assumed that once they reached free territory, his responsibility would end. He would start his own life, find work, build the existence that had been denied him under slavery. But Margaret's words made him realize that his knowledge, his ability to navigate the escape route, his talent for leadership and strategy were valuable in ways that extended beyond his personal freedom. There were thousands still enslaved, thousands who needed someone to guide them north, someone who understood both the slave system and the geography of escape because he had lived it and survived it. But first, Samuel had to actually reach free soil himself, and the most dangerous part of the journey still lay ahead. Could they possibly make it across the heavily patrolled border into Pennsylvania? The Pennsylvania border was where the maximum danger concentrated, where slave catchers knew fugitives would attempt to cross, where patrols were thickest and vigilance was highest. Samuel spent 2 days observing the area from hiding, studying the patrol patterns, identifying the times and locations where surveillance seemed weakest. He noticed that the patrols focused on main roads and obvious crossing points, operating under the assumption that enslaved people were unsophisticated and would take the most direct routes. Samuel's strategy was to do exactly the opposite, to cross at the most difficult terrain where the slave catchers wouldn't expect anyone to attempt passage. They crossed in the early morning hours through a steep, rocky area that required dangerous climbing and left them exhausted and scraped bloody. but got them across the border undetected. Pennsylvania soil felt no different beneath Samuel's feet. Same dirt, same rocks, same trees. But everything had changed. They were in free territory now, where slavery was illegal, where they had at least some legal protections, where the nightmare of bondage was theoretically behind them. The group broke down weeping, holding each other, unable to fully process that they had actually done the impossible thing, that they were free, that Samuel's leadership had brought them through. But Samuel understood something the others didn't yet grasp. Crossing into Pennsylvania was just one stage of the journey, not the destination. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that even in free states, they could be captured and returned to slavery if caught. True safety required reaching Canada, and that meant another 1,000 miles of dangerous travel. More immediately, they needed to connect with the Underground Railroad network in Pennsylvania, needed to find the people who could hide them, feed them, and direct them further north toward ultimate safety. Over the next month, Samuel guided his group through Pennsylvania, moving from station to station, learning the codes and signals of the Underground Railroad, meeting the remarkable network of black and white abolitionists who were risking everything to facilitate escapes. He met formerly enslaved people who had made the journey years earlier and now dedicated their lives to helping others make it. He met Quakers and free black communities who operated safe houses. He met white abolitionists whose commitment to ending slavery had moved beyond words into dangerous action. And everywhere he went, people told him the same thing. They needed conductors, people brave and capable enough to travel back south and guide others out. The suggestion seemed insane, suicidal even. Samuel had barely survived his own escape, and now people were asking him to voluntarily return to slave territory, where he would face immediate re-enslavement or execution if caught. Every rational instinct told him to keep moving north to Canada, to secure his own freedom, to start the life he'd risked everything to achieve. But Samuel couldn't stop thinking about the people still trapped on the Maryland plantation where he'd been enslaved, about the millions throughout the South who would never have the information and guidance that had made his escape possible, about the fact that he possessed knowledge that could literally save lives. So Samuel made a decision that would define him as one of the great heroes of American history. He decided to go back. Was Samuel insane to voluntarily return to the place where he'd been enslaved? Or was this the sanest thing he'd ever done? After ensuring that Hannah, Esther, Isaac, James, and Clara were safely established in Canada with jobs and housing, Samuel returned to Pennsylvania and began his training as an Underground Railroad conductor. The network was more organized and sophisticated than he had imagined, with established routes, communication systems, and protocols designed to maximize safety and efficiency. Samuel studied under an experienced conductor named William, a formerly enslaved man who had been running missions into the South for nearly a decade and had personally guided over 200 people to freedom. William taught Samuel the advanced skills of the trade, how to forge freedom papers, how to disguise fugitives as free black people traveling legitimately, how to bribe corrupt officials, how to read whether a potential ally could be trusted or was actually a slave catcher in disguise. The work required Samuel to become multiple people depending on the situation. Sometimes he posed as a free black tradesman traveling on business. Other times he disguised himself as a slave accompanying his master, a white abolitionist playing a role. He learned to modulate his speech patterns, to adopt the exaggerated subservience that white people expected from black people when that served his purposes, and to carry himself with the confidence of a free man when that was more advantageous. This wasn't code switching for survival, but strategic deployment of different personas as tools of liberation, and Samuel became a master at reading situations and becoming whoever he needed to be to accomplish his mission. His first mission back into Maryland was terrifying. Every step onto slave territory felt like walking into a trap. Every white face seemed to be studying him with suspicion. Every sound made him certain he'd been discovered. Samuel was returning to the plantation where he'd been enslaved to guide out a family. A mother named Ruth and her 3 children who were about to be sold to different buyers and separated forever. The plantation owner had no idea that Samuel was anything other than a vague memory of a runaway from years ago, and certainly didn't recognize the confident, free black man who approached Ruth in the slave quarters late one night and told her that if she was ready to run, he would guide her and her children to freedom. Ruth looked at Samuel like he was an angel or a ghost, unable to believe that someone had come for her, that escape was actually possible. Samuel had 3 days before the slave sale, 3 days to prepare Ruth and her children for a journey they were utterly unprepared for, 3 days to arrange logistics and plan a route. He worked with the precision and calm of a military commander, showing none of the fear churning in his gut, projecting absolute confidence because he knew Ruth needed to believe he could save her. When they slipped away from the plantation on the appointed night, Samuel guided them with the same skill that had served him on his own escape, getting them to the first safe house, and then passing them on to another conductor who would continue their journey north. Samuel returned to Pennsylvania having successfully completed his first mission as a conductor, and the experience transformed his understanding of his own capabilities and purpose. He wasn't just saving himself anymore. He was deploying his intelligence, courage, and hard-won knowledge in service of liberating others, and the feeling was more powerful than anything he'd experienced. Over the next 12 years, Samuel would make approximately 19 trips into slave territory, guiding roughly 300 people to freedom, becoming one of the most successful conductors in the Underground Railroad's history. But success brought its own dangers, and the more famous Samuel became in abolitionist circles, the more determined the slaveholders became to capture him. How long could Samuel's luck possibly hold before the slave catchers finally caught up to him? The slave states put a bounty on Samuel's head, $5,000 for his capture, an enormous sum that made him one of the most wanted fugitives in America. Wanted posters described him in detail, offered rewards for information, promised legal immunity to anyone who helped capture him. Every trip south became exponentially more dangerous as slave catchers specifically hunted for him. As plantation owners warned their enslaved people about the dangerous criminal named Samuel, who was supposedly leading people to their deaths in the frozen north. The slaveholders' propaganda painted conductors as villains, as kidnappers, who tricked gullible slaves into running away to starvation and suffering, because acknowledging the truth that enslaved people desperately wanted freedom and were willing to risk everything to achieve it would undermine the entire ideological justification for slavery. Samuel knew he was being hunted, knew that capture would mean not just re-enslavement, but public execution as an example to terrify other potential runaways. Yet he kept going back, kept making the dangerous trips into slave territory, because the work was too important to stop and there were too few people willing and capable of doing it. Each mission followed a similar pattern, but required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Samuel would receive word through the network about enslaved people ready to escape. Sometimes individuals, sometimes families, sometimes groups of unrelated people united only by their desperate desire for freedom. He would travel south using forged papers that identified him as a free black man conducting legitimate business, moving through slave territory with the confident bearing of someone who had every right to be there. Once in the target area, Samuel would make contact with the potential runaways, assess their readiness and capability, and make the final decision about whether they could survive the journey. This was perhaps the hardest part of his work. Sometimes he had to tell people they weren't ready, that attempting escape would result in capture and horrific punishment, that they needed more preparation or to wait for better circumstances. Those conversations broke Samuel's heart, but he understood that his responsibility was to maximize successful escapes, not to give false hope to people who weren't prepared for the journey's demands. The ones he did accept, Samuel prepared with the same thoroughness he'd applied to his own escape. He taught them navigation, survival skills, codes and signals of the Underground Railroad, how to comport themselves when hiding in safe houses, what to do if they became separated from the group. He impressed upon them the absolute necessity of silence, discipline, and trust. One person panicking or disobeying instructions could doom the entire group. Then, on the appointed night, they would begin the journey north, with Samuel as their pilot through the treacherous landscape of slave territory. The trips typically took between 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the starting point and the group's capabilities, and every moment was fraught with potential disaster. They traveled through forests and swamps, across rivers and mountains, through territory patrolled by men who would happily kill them for the bounty money. Samuel guided them with a combination of memorized routes, improvisation, and instinct developed over years of experience. He knew which safe houses were still operational and which had been compromised. He knew which river crossings were being watched and which offered relatively safe passage. He knew how to read the behavior of white people they encountered, could tell in seconds whether someone was likely to raise an alarm or could be bluffed or bribed into looking the other way. His passengers often didn't understand the constant calculations Samuel was making, the split-second decisions that kept them alive, the way he was constantly reading the environment and adjusting their route based on dangers they couldn't perceive. They just knew that Samuel had never lost a passenger, that everyone he guided reached free territory, and that following his instructions exactly was the key to survival. But even Samuel's legendary skill couldn't eliminate all risk, and there were close calls that nearly ended in disaster. Once, while guiding a group of 7 through Delaware, they were spotted by a patrol and had to scatter into the woods, agreeing to reunite at a predetermined location. Samuel spent 2 terrifying days relocating all 7 people, certain he'd lost some of them, before successfully reassembling the group and continuing north. Another time, a supposedly safe house turned out to be compromised. The abolitionist family had been arrested and replaced with slave catchers lying in wait. Samuel's instinct sensed something wrong as they approached, and he diverted the group at the last moment, potentially saving them from capture. These near disasters aged Samuel rapidly, adding gray to his hair and lines to his face. But they also refined his skills, taught him to trust his intuition even when he couldn't articulate exactly what was setting off his internal alarms. The psychological toll of the work was immense, though Samuel rarely spoke about it. He carried the weight of every life depending on him. The knowledge that one mistake could result in his passengers being dragged back to slavery and punishment so severe it would serve as deterrent to others. He lived with constant fear disguised as confidence, with the knowledge that he was one of the most hunted men in America, with the understanding that his luck would eventually run out. Sleep was difficult, filled with nightmares of capture, of passengers being torn from his protection, of facing the slaveholders who wanted him dead. Yet Samuel continued the work year after year, mission after mission, because stopping felt like betraying everyone still trapped in bondage. Everyone who needed someone to guide them toward freedom. Would the pressure and danger eventually break even someone as strong as Samuel? By 1850, Samuel had been working as a conductor for 12 years and had personally guided approximately 250 people to freedom. He was in his mid-30s, which felt ancient given the stress and danger of his work, and he was beginning to think about stepping back from active missions into a support role. That's when the Fugitive Slave Act passed, fundamentally changing the landscape of the Underground Railroad and making Samuel's work more essential and dangerous than ever. The new law required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners even if found in free states, eliminated most legal protections for accused fugitives, and imposed severe penalties on anyone caught helping runaways. It effectively meant that nowhere in the United States was truly safe for formerly enslaved people. Only Canada offered genuine security from recapture. The Fugitive Slave Act energized the abolitionist movement while simultaneously making the Underground Railroad's work far more perilous. Samuel's response to the new law was characteristic. He didn't retreat, but doubled down, making his missions longer to guide people all the way to Canada rather than just to free states, accepting greater risk because the need was greater than ever. He also began training new conductors, passing on his knowledge and skills to a younger generation who would continue the work when he could no longer do it. Among his students was a young woman named Harriet, herself an escaped slave, who would go on to become the most famous conductor in Underground Railroad history. Samuel recognized in Harriet the same qualities he possessed: brilliant strategic thinking, unshakable courage, deep commitment to liberation, and he taught her everything he knew, understanding that she would surpass even his accomplishments. Training new conductors was perhaps Samuel's greatest legacy, the way he multiplied his impact beyond what one person could achieve alone. He taught them not just the practical skills of navigation and disguise, but the psychological dimensions of the work. How to project confidence when terrified, how to read people and situations, how to make impossible decisions quickly, how to live with the weight of lives depending on your judgment. He taught them that being a conductor wasn't about being fearless, but about acting despite fear. That courage wasn't the absence of terror, but the decision to move forward anyway. Most importantly, he taught them to see enslaved people not as helpless victims needing rescue, but as intelligent agents of their own liberation who needed guidance and support to accomplish what they were already determined to do. The community of conductors that Samuel helped build was predominantly black, composed largely of formerly enslaved people who risked returning to slave territory because they couldn't rest while their people remained in bondage. This fact is often obscured in popular narratives that center white abolitionists as the primary agents of the Underground Railroad, but the historical record is clear. Black conductors did the most dangerous work, made the most trips into slave territory, and guided the most people to freedom. They had advantages that white conductors lacked. They understood the slave system from inside, could move through black communities without arousing suspicion, spoke the language and knew the cultural codes, and possessed a level of commitment born from personal experience of slavery's horrors. Samuel was part of this remarkable community of black freedom fighters, and his work was amplified by his collaboration with dozens of others engaged in the same dangerous mission. By 1855, Samuel's reputation had grown to legendary proportions in both abolitionist and slave-holding circles. The bounty on his head had increased to an astonishing $10,000, and his name was invoked with reverence by enslaved people throughout Maryland and hatred by the slaveholders who couldn't catch him. Samuel had personally guided over 300 people to freedom by this point, a staggering number that represented not just individual liberations, but entire families kept together, children saved from being sold away from parents, communities of formerly enslaved people establishing new lives in Canada. The economic impact of Samuel's work was significant. 300 enslaved people represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost property value to slaveholders. A devastating blow to the slave economy that demonstrated the vulnerability of a system that depended on keeping human beings imprisoned against their will. But the constant danger was taking its toll, and Samuel knew his time as an active conductor was approaching its end. He was now in his late 30s, considered old for such physically demanding and stressful work, and his body bore the accumulated injuries and exhaustion of 17 years of missions into slave territory. More concerning, slave catchers were getting better at their job, learning the Underground Railroad's methods, infiltrating abolitionist circles, using more sophisticated tracking techniques. Several conductors Samuel knew personally had been captured and killed, their deaths serving as brutal reminders that no amount of skill or experience could eliminate risk entirely. Samuel began planning his final missions, determined to go out on his own terms rather than through capture, knowing that the work would continue through the conductors he'd trained and the network he'd helped build. His final mission, undertaken in the winter of 1856, would become the most challenging and dangerous of his entire career. The slave catchers were waiting, the weather was treacherous, and Samuel was about to face a situation that would test everything he'd learned over 17 years as a conductor. Would this be the mission where his legendary luck finally ran out? Or would Samuel find a way to triumph one last time? Samuel received word about a group of 11 enslaved people on a Virginia plantation who were ready to escape, the largest group he'd ever attempted to guide at once. The timing was terrible. It was January, meaning freezing temperatures and potential snowstorms that could be fatal. The location was deep in slave territory, requiring a journey of over 300 miles to reach Canada. And most concerning, Samuel's sources indicated that slave catchers were actively hunting in the area, aware that an escape was being planned, even if they didn't know the specific timing. Every logical calculation said to decline this mission, to wait for better circumstances, to acknowledge that the risk was simply too high. But Samuel looked at the information about the 11 people, including 5 children, the youngest only 4 years old, and knew he couldn't abandon them to slavery just because the mission was dangerous. Every mission was dangerous. This one was just more obviously so. Samuel spent 2 weeks preparing, assembling supplies for 11 people, arranging an extensive network of safe houses for the extended journey, coordinating with other conductors who would assist at various stages, and planning multiple contingency routes in case the primary path was blocked. He studied weather patterns and planned the departure for a narrow window between winter storms. He sent detailed instructions to the 11 people through trusted intermediaries, preparing them as much as possible for what they were about to endure. Then, in late January 1856, Samuel traveled to Virginia using forged documents that identified him as a prosperous free black merchant inspecting properties for potential purchase, a disguise that explained why he was traveling through slave territory and asking questions about local geography. The plantation where the 11 were enslaved was owned by a man named Henderson, notorious for cruelty even by the standards of slaveholders. Henderson had recently purchased several of the 11 specifically to split up families and resell individuals for profit, which had triggered their desperate determination to escape before they could be separated. Samuel made contact with the group's leader, a man named Moses, who had been secretly planning this escape for months and had managed to gather supplies and information. Moses's intelligence and preparation impressed Samuel. Here was another natural conductor, another brilliant strategist who had figured out much of what Samuel had to teach just through careful observation and planning. If they survived this journey, Samuel thought, Moses would make an excellent candidate for conductor training. The escape was planned for a moonless night during a cold snap, when patrols would be less vigilant and the frozen ground would leave fewer tracks for dogs to follow. Samuel positioned himself at the meeting point in the woods beyond the plantation's boundaries and waited, every nerve alert for sounds of pursuit or ambush. Right on schedule, the 11 emerged from the darkness. Moses and his wife Dinah, 6 other adults, and the 5 children ranging in age from 4 to 14. They looked terrified and exhausted and desperate, and they looked at Samuel with expressions that mixed hope and disbelief that this legendary conductor had actually come for them personally. Samuel gave them the same calm, confident nod he'd given hundreds of others, the gesture that said, "I've got you, trust me, we're going to make it," even though he had no idea if that was true. They moved out immediately, Samuel setting a pace that was demanding but sustainable, knowing they needed to cover maximum distance before their absence was discovered at dawn. The children were the main concern. The 4-year-old had to be carried, which slowed them down, and exhausted the adults taking turns bearing the weight. Samuel had anticipated this and planned the route accordingly, prioritizing safe houses with shorter intervals rather than maximum distance covered. By dawn, they had reached the first station, a free black family's home on the outskirts of a small town, and they hid in a concealed basement room while Henderson's slave catchers swept the area looking for them. Samuel could hear the dogs baying in the distance, hear the shouted coordination of the search, and he kept the group calm and silent through sheer force of his confidence and authority. They stayed hidden for 2 days until the initial search moved to other areas, then continued north under Samuel's guidance. The journey became a test of endurance that pushed everyone to their limits. The cold was brutal, the snow made travel treacherous. The children struggled with the physical demands, and fear was a constant companion. Samuel guided them with all the skill accumulated over 17 years, using every trick and technique he'd learned, calling in favors from every contact in his network, improvising solutions to problems as they arose. When they reached a river that was too dangerous to cross at the expected location, Samuel located an alternative crossing 5 miles upstream. When one of the adults became severely ill and couldn't travel, Samuel arranged for them to stay at a safe house until recovered, while the rest continued on. When slave catchers appeared unexpectedly on a road they were crossing, Samuel, quick thinking, diverted the group into a swamp where the dogs couldn't track them. The mission lasted 5 weeks, far longer than anticipated, pushing through February and into early March before they finally crossed into Canada. It was the longest, hardest journey Samuel had ever guided, and there were multiple moments when he thought they wouldn't make it, when the combination of weather and pursuit and sheer physical exhaustion seemed insurmountable. But Samuel kept them moving, kept them believing, kept solving each problem as it arose. And on March 8, 1856, all 11 people, including the 4-year-old child, stepped onto Canadian soil as free people. They collapsed, weeping and laughing, unable to fully process that they'd survived, that Samuel had actually guided them through hundreds of miles of slave territory in winter and gotten them to safety. Moses embraced Samuel with tears streaming down his face, thanking him for saving his family, for keeping them together, for giving them the chance at freedom they'd risked everything to achieve. Samuel returned to Pennsylvania exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness, feeling every one of his 38 years, and then some. He knew with absolute certainty that this had been his final mission as an active conductor. He simply didn't have another journey like that left in him. But as he reflected on what he'd accomplished, Samuel felt a deep sense of peace and completion. He had guided over 300 people to freedom across 17 years and 19 missions into slave territory. He had trained dozens of other conductors who would continue the work. He had struck meaningful blows against the slave system, liberating people one by one while demonstrating that enslaved people were brilliant, capable, strategic thinkers who could outwit their oppressors. That was a legacy worth retiring on, Samuel thought, even as he knew he would continue supporting the Underground Railroad in other ways for as long as the evil institution of slavery existed. What Samuel couldn't know in 1856 was that slavery's end was approaching faster than anyone anticipated, that the contradictions and tensions that had been building for decades were about to explode into civil war. He would live to see the Emancipation Proclamation, would witness the Union Army enlisting black soldiers who fought for their people's liberation, would experience the 13th Amendment officially ending slavery throughout the United States. And when slavery finally died, Samuel would know that he had played a part in killing it, that every person he'd guided to freedom was a victory against an evil system, that his work had mattered in ways both individual and systemic. The institution that had claimed to own him had been defeated, not by its own moral awakening, but by the resistance of enslaved people like Samuel who refused to accept their bondage and fought for their freedom with intelligence, courage, and strategic brilliance. Samuel lived until 1871, long enough to see the early years of Reconstruction and the first tentative steps toward black political participation and civil rights. He spent his later years working with freedmen's aid societies, helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom, just as he'd helped them escape bondage years earlier. He told his stories to anyone who would listen, ensuring that the history of the Underground Railroad and its brave conductors would be preserved and passed down. When he died at age 56, worn out from decades of struggle, but having lived to see slavery's end, his funeral in Philadelphia was attended by hundreds of people, many of them individuals he'd personally guided to freedom, or their children and grandchildren who existed because Samuel had saved their ancestors. They came to honor the man who had risked everything for them, the conductor who had never lost a passenger, the freedom fighter who embodied the courage and brilliance of his people. The legacy of conductors like Samuel extends far beyond the specific individuals they saved, important as those individual liberations were. Their work demonstrated truths that the slave system desperately tried to suppress. That enslaved people were intelligent, strategic, capable of complex planning and execution, and absolutely determined to be free. The existence of the Underground Railroad proved that slavery could only be maintained through overwhelming violence and surveillance, that the moment those controls weakened even slightly, people would escape en masse. The conductors showed that black people were agents of their own liberation, not passive victims waiting to be rescued by white saviors. They demonstrated that resistance was possible even in the most oppressive circumstances, that courage and intelligence could overcome even the most powerful systems of control, and that individual action could create systemic change. The stories of black conductors like Samuel have often been overshadowed in popular culture by narratives that center white abolitionists or that treat enslaved people as objects being moved along an underground railroad rather than as active participants in their own liberation. But the historical record is clear. Black people, often formerly enslaved themselves, did the most dangerous work of the Underground Railroad. They were the ones who traveled repeatedly into slave territory at tremendous personal risk. They were the ones who possessed the knowledge, skills, and community connections that made successful escapes possible. They were the ones who understood both the slave system and the psychology of enslaved people from lived experience. And they were the ones who kept going back, mission after mission, because they couldn't rest while their people remained in bondage. Samuel's story represents thousands of similar stories, most of which were never recorded because the participants were too busy fighting for freedom to document their activities, and because a white supremacist society didn't value black lives enough to preserve their histories. For every Samuel whose story survives in fragments of historical record, there were dozens of other conductors whose names are lost, whose accomplishments are unrecorded, whose courage is unremembered. They operated in secrecy out of necessity, leaving few documents that could compromise their networks if discovered. Their legacy lives in the people they saved and in the descendants of those people, in the families that exist, because a conductor guided their ancestor to freedom. In the fact that slavery ended not through slaveholders' voluntary choice, but through the resistance of enslaved people and their allies who made the system unsustainable. The Underground Railroad was never a single organization with centralized leadership, but rather a loose network of safe houses, conductors, and allies united by commitment to ending slavery through direct action. It operated on principles of mutual aid and collective resistance, with information shared through codes and signals, with trust built through shared risk and common purpose. The network included people of different races and backgrounds, but black people, particularly formerly enslaved people, were its backbone and its most essential operatives. They were the ones who had the most to lose and who took the greatest risks. And they did so because freedom was worth any price, and because leaving their people in bondage was unacceptable. When we remember the Underground Railroad today, we must center the stories of black conductors like Samuel, whose intelligence and courage made the network function. We must recognize that the railroad wasn't a charitable operation run by benevolent whites, but a resistance movement led primarily by black people fighting for their own liberation and the liberation of their people. We must understand that enslaved people were never passive or content with their bondage, but were constantly resisting in ways large and small, from work slowdowns and tool breaking to escape and rebellion. And we must acknowledge that the end of slavery came not through moral persuasion, but through the determined resistance of enslaved people who made the institution economically and politically unsustainable, who fought for their freedom in countless ways including escape, and who ultimately took up arms during the Civil War to destroy the system that had claimed to own them. The river of history flows on, carrying forward the legacy of those who fought for freedom, and we who live in their wake owe them more than memory. We owe them the commitment to continuing their work. Because while legal slavery ended in 1865, the struggle for genuine freedom, equality, and justice continues. The descendants of enslaved people still face systemic oppression, still fight for recognition of their full humanity, still navigate a society built on white supremacy that has adapted its methods but not abandoned its fundamental hierarchies. The spirit of conductors like Samuel, the courage, the strategic intelligence, the unwavering commitment to liberation is still needed today, still relevant, still calling to those who have ears to hear and hearts willing to respond. Samuel and the other conductors understood something essential, that freedom must be seized, not granted. That waiting for oppressors to voluntarily relinquish their power is futile. That justice requires action and sacrifice and risk. They understood that individual liberation and collective liberation are intertwined, that no one is truly free while others remain in bondage, that the fight for justice is never finished but must be taken up by each generation. They demonstrated that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, that intelligence and strategy can overcome even overwhelming power, and that commitment to a cause larger than oneself gives life meaning and purpose. When we stand today at the crossroads of history, facing our own systems of oppression and injustice, we should ask ourselves what Samuel would do. Would he accept the status quo because challenging it is dangerous? Would he wait for permission to resist injustice? Would he prioritize his own safety over the liberation of his people? The answer to all these questions is obviously no. Samuel chose courage over safety, chose resistance over compliance, chose the dangerous path of freedom fighting because the alternative, accepting slavery, was unthinkable. His life challenges us to examine our own choices, our own commitments, our own willingness to take risks for justice. The boat Samuel never had to row, unlike Mary Meekum, was replaced with his own body as the vessel of liberation, his feet walking the dangerous paths, his voice giving instructions and encouragement, his hands supporting those who stumbled, his mind constantly calculating and strategizing. He made himself into a bridge between slavery and freedom, a living connection that people could cross to reach liberation. That bridge was built from courage and intelligence and deep love for his people, and it supported hundreds of crossings before Samuel finally stepped back to let others continue the work. The bridge still stands in the form of Samuel's legacy, in the lessons he taught, in the conductors he trained, in the descendants of the people he saved, in the memory of what one determined person can accomplish when driven by commitment to justice. Freedom, Samuel understood, is not a location but a state of being, not a destination but a continuous practice. Crossing into Canada didn't automatically make people free in the full sense. They had to learn how to be free, how to make choices about their own lives, how to exist as full human beings rather than property. The journey to freedom didn't end at the border but continued throughout life as formerly enslaved people built new identities, healed from trauma, created communities, and worked to bring down the system that had oppressed them. Samuel guided people through the first stage of that journey, the physical escape from slave territory. But he understood that the longer journey toward genuine freedom and healing would take much more time and would require different kinds of support and struggle. The memory of Samuel and conductors like him is not meant to inspire passive admiration, but active emulation. Their stories don't exist to make us feel good about how far we've come, but to challenge us about how far we still have to go. They demand that we ask ourselves hard questions about what we're willing to risk for justice, what systems of oppression we're willing to challenge, whose freedom we're fighting for. They remind us that the most important history is often made by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, by individuals who decide that injustice is unacceptable and commit themselves to fighting it regardless of the cost. Samuel's hands, which once picked tobacco in a Maryland field, which later gripped the hands of frightened children crossing dangerous rivers, which forged freedom papers and packed supplies and pointed north toward Canada, those hands built freedom one person at a time. They were calloused and scarred and strong, marked by labor both forced and chosen, and they embodied the truth that liberation is physical work, concrete action, the application of intelligence and courage to the practical problem of moving people from bondage to freedom. We honor those hands not with monuments alone, but by using our own hands to continue the work of building justice, by refusing to accept oppression, by reaching out to guide others toward liberation, just as Samuel guided hundreds before us. The final lesson of Samuel's life is perhaps the most important: that the fight for freedom is worth it, that justice is possible even when it seems impossible, that courage and intelligence can overcome even the most oppressive systems, and that individual action matters more than we can imagine. Samuel was one person, born into slavery with every force arrayed against him, with no resources except his brilliant mind and unshakable will. Yet he freed over 300 people, trained dozens of conductors, struck meaningful blows against slavery, and left a legacy that inspires us generations later. If one person can do that much, what might we accomplish if we commit ourselves with equal determination to the ongoing work of liberation and justice? That is Samuel's question to us, his challenge across the generations, his gift to those willing to receive it. May we prove worthy of his legacy. May we find in ourselves the courage he demonstrated. And may we continue the journey toward freedom that he piloted so brilliantly, knowing that the work is never finished, but trusting that each step forward matters. Each person liberated changes the world. Each act of courage contributes to the eventual triumph of justice over oppression.